seems like we're ready to we're just going to go and see what happens.
I think we're going to go. Yes, this is going to be a dialogue with the topic being inflation. Yes.
Yes. So I'm going to tell you. I mean, and this is what I think inflation is, even having talked to you. So we'll go with it. Inflate my dollar that I have loses value over time. I can buy less with it. So in 1900, I could take $1 and buy a week's worth of food, and now $1 gets me nothing. So I think that's inflation. Tell me why I'm wrong.
So what is the? Because what I'm interested in trying to get at. There's lots of empirical measures of inflation and lots of kind of quick definitions. And that's a very good one to start with because that's very clear. I would just like to take that and like work on it a little more to see if we can make it conceptually deeper. So if that is the case, that your dollar in 1900 bought a week's worth of groceries and your dollar today, we don't even know what it buys because there's so little in it.
Yes.
What does that mean has occurred? Like, what is the phenomenon that inflation is naming?
Well, so again, I think it's my dollar got, like the simplest thing I can think of is my dollar got less valuable. It gets me less value in the world, measured in terms of food, measured in terms of like an automobile, which used to be $800 and is now $100. The British Jane Austen, they have 5,000 pounds a year. Can you believe it? They have a giant mansion and a staff, and they go rent another mansion in the country sometimes, and they bring the staff with them. 5,000 pounds a year, right? Something like I can name, here's like, I thought about this before we started talking. Here's what I can name that's cheaper, like historical period in the past, historical right now, computers. A personal computer, they're so cheap, we have 8 of them in the house. We bought one when I was a kid, and that was $3,000 at a time when everything else cost, you know, much, much less, all of the food, all of the whatever. Coherent, I know it's incoherent when because I've talked to you, when we try and measure it over the short term. All we're doing is taking a basket of goods and noting that the basket of goods is going up in value. So, you know, and we make the basket varied, diversified. We put oil in there and we put food or, you know, some baseline commodity. And when those prices go up, we say, oh, inflation is rising. Sam, for I know Sam, has said to me, no, look at this. Look at these things which are going down. Some things are going up, yes, other things are going down. That doesn't, so it cannot be the case that the dollar is losing value there. So
that's great. So I'm not Sam, I'm going to play Socrates today.
Okay.
And so what I will say, but that's fine for you to invoke that. That's very helpful because we got a lot of things on the page already, right? So yeah. I'm just going to separate them all out, right? So I'm going to start with the Jane Austen novels because that's been one of Thomas Piketty's famous examples. That's very interesting, which is that we don't talk about money in literature after the Victorian period because inflation makes claims about money meaningless. Because if someone writes in their 1964 novel that this costs $3, and they mean for that to invoke that it's super expensive, and we read it today, it doesn't invoke that at all. But in the 19th century, we had this very weird period, very, very narrowly, in Britain at the height of its colonial power on the international reserve currency being the British pound, tied to the gold standard, sort of kind of, we can bracket that out. You had this period of multiple decades where we had basic deflation, very, very little inflation, sometimes deflationary. And so your 5,000 pounds, and everyone knew, Austen's readers all knew how much capital you had to have, how much total wealth you had to have to generate 5,000 pounds a year in returns on government bonds. And this is the other thing, we had very, very low inflation, but the British government was paying very high interest on government bonds. So if you had wealth, you were set in a way that we can't even imagine today, even though we think about super, super, super rich people, because you have deflation, your money's basically worth a little bit more as you go into the future. And you don't have to invest in the stock market or give it to your buddy who's got a brilliant tech startup idea. You just put it in government bonds in gilt, and you get back 6%, and then you live on that. So no one's touching the capital, and they're living on that. So that's an important kind of historical touchstone of there's not always been inflation. There's been a deflationary period that was meaningful in these ways. And a lot of the arguments about inflation today are wishing we could go back to that. And we may want to talk about like why that would be a horrible idea and why it was great for the Gilded Age radical inequality, because when you have deflation, rich people's money becomes more valuable and poor people suffer more. But we can bracket that for now, because what I really want to get at is the difference that you had between your focus when I said, what is inflation? Tell me what you think it is. I heard you getting back to the idea that it is a phenomenon that has to do with money. Yes, it relates to the prices of all the goods and services in society. It relates to commodities. But fundamentally, what's going on at core is that the money is worth less. And if the money is worth less, all the other stuff costs more. And that's what's fundamentally happening. And that means that this empirical measure of inflation, because one of the things I wanted to be able to talk about is just, what does it actually mean? What is the concept of inflation? And have that over here before we then went over here and said, well, what do we do when we go out in the world and try to look for it and try to prove it and try to verify it? Because of course we're inundated by news stories these days of this inflationary data went up and that one went down and this one went up more than we thought it would and this one is growing. And there are 15 different metrics. They're released every 6 weeks. So if you're in journalism, you can write an inflation story every 3 days and have it say really whatever you want, because depending on which metric you use, they're either going up too fast or not going down fast enough, et cetera. But I want to get back to, what does it mean that if the core concept of inflation is that money is worth less?
Okay.
What does that mean to you, either in something we've previously discussed or in your head or in your life?
The only definition I can think of is empirical. I go out to a store. I go online if I'm going to buy things. Again, during the pandemic, the specific good that I was buying, or when I go out to eat, going out to eat is much more expensive. Food in general seems to have gotten much more expensive. My dollar buys less. I'm calling that inflation. And that is, I mean, the only other thing I can do is go back, and this is the example I gave you last time. My dad in 1990 was making $60,000 a year, lived in a beautiful house, put 2 kids through expensive private college, has retired in incredible comfort, on an amount of money that, it's below the, like, you cannot live with a family of 4 for $60,000 and see. I mean, you could try. I imagine people are trying.
Yeah. People are trying. They're struggling, but they're trying, right?
Yeah. So that, whatever that is, right, and I've cheated, right? I've talked about a short-term phenomenon and tried to link it with a very long-term phenomenon. Again, like, going back, I think the farther I go back, the more money bought.
One way to start adding texture to that would be to think about, because one of the things you've gotten at is, okay, if inflation is a concept of the value of money, or in even more basic terms, what money can buy and how much money can buy, then there's another meaningful metric that sometimes is included but is often left out, which is income, right? So you have compared what one would need to make in 2023 in Seattle, what income you would need to make to live comfortably, versus a salary number that your father had, whatever this was, 40 years ago?
Yeah,
okay.
90, so 35 years ago, yeah.
35 years ago. So one of the things we would need to know is what was a $60,000 income 35 years ago? Because if we think about it today, we just know, well, you can't live, a family of 4 can't live on that in a lot of the more expensive American cities. But what was rent in 1990 Seattle, that also would be a scandalously small number probably in our heads.
Right.
Where did $60,000 put you on the income distribution? Because this is the other thing, is that the more we spread out time, particularly because inflation is an interest compounding phenomenon. So you can have very small amounts of inflation, but if you have it year upon year upon year upon year, you get big number changes. My guess is that a $60,000 a year income in, let's say, 1990 is probably 90th percentile.
So, I mean, right? I always thought that seemed like a lot to me. And that's fine, but that's still that's still coherent as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, wages go up and the price of houses go up. So he was at 90. Like, we're still measuring that with money. We're still using the same yardstick. So yeah, one of them goes up and the other goes up.
So maybe we do this hypothetical, because we're constantly comparing across randomly picked time periods and particular arguments. So you live in Seattle, housing is insanely expensive in Seattle. If we were talking about the rental prices in Des Moines, Iowa, and we compared them today to 1990, we might be surprised at how small the difference is. Also, the incomes have probably gone up less there. But what if we did the example of what would it mean if we could set all of these rates the same? So we could say every single thing in the world that has a price, and incomes have a price, wages have a price, they all will uniformly rise. And it doesn't really matter what number we assign, 1%, 2%, 5%, 10%. Would that be inflation? And would it be meaningful in the way that we talk about inflation today?
So yeah, that's right. That is much clearer, right? And there I immediately see the problem. Nothing changes, right? If everything is, nothing has really changed if wages and prices of houses and whatever go up at the same time. We have, I mean, this is what you're always trying to get me to see, and I see it, but like, you're just redefining the meter at that point. A meter is now like whatever it is, 10 millionth of the distance to the, you still measure things with it and they still measure the same. So that, and we know it, I mean, you and I have just spat out a bunch of examples. We know that's not the case. It is freaking more expensive to buy a house in Seattle relative to what people make than it was in 1980. It's really cheap to buy houses in Seattle in 1980. Then some stuff happened, like other economic whatever. So even if you were making what would be good salaries, 90th percentile salaries, so let's say by 2000 you're making $100,000 a year, you're fucking rich. That's insane. But you're going to have trouble buying a house in Seattle if you don't have help or wealth or something.
If you have a house in Seattle or were able to buy one at some point during that period, you actually may have far more wealth, right? So we can take your dad example of a salary in the 90s, but if we go back a generation later to the person who bought the house in 1970, in 1995, it's worth a bit more, but the person who bought the house in 1995 has become wealthy if they were able to continue to afford the taxes and the upkeep on it, and the rest of their life continued. The house appreciation in cities like Seattle over the last 25-year period is itself wealth generating. So, which is one way of getting at the amazing rise in inequality over the last 25 years. But I guess what I would want to get back to is we're now talking about something different. We're talking about the price of houses in particular regions, and we're talking about them relative to the price of other things, which isn't quite talking about inflation, because now we're talking about a thing that really, really screws some people over. Like, if you're trying to work on a minimum wage job in Seattle, now you can't afford to live, and in 1990, maybe you sort of could. If you're upper middle class and you bought a house in Seattle in the late 90s, now you have a huge amount of wealth that you wouldn't have had in the previous 25-year period. So now we're talking about changes among people in certain demographics of income and wealth, and the prices of certain things relative to one another. We're not actually talking about inflation anymore. And I guess part of where I'm trying to push the conversation is that this bit is actually the more significant and interesting bit, and the more meaningful bit in terms of how some people are thriving and some people are suffering. Some people are experiencing economic precarity, economic insecurity. Some are actually experiencing, even though lots of things are more precarious in some way, they're actually seeing an extreme of wealth generation that we hadn't seen much before. But we've gotten away from, there's this thing called inflation, and it's terrible, and we don't want that.
I mean, I'm like, I'm ready to jump ahead with you. I don't know if we should stop because like, I'm like, yeah, okay, let's go.
Now we have nothing to say about inflation.
I mean, well, I mean, I could take us in a bunch of directions. Like, right, what everyone's talking. I mean, I totally agree with you. I like, and I don't know if we've made this point to other people besides us, that when the journalist writes about inflation out of the basket of goods that and calls it inflation, that's incoherent. The value of dollar is not shrinking because, again, I'm quoting you now, but I'm going to quote you anyway. Money's just a measure. It's just how we're measuring things. But if you increase the measure to twice as what it was, nothing under here changes. Instead, what's happening?
And part of the, I mean,
that thing's more expensive. That thing's cheaper. Relative to, I don't know what. I mean, like, what is even the baseline at that point? Some things are going up, some things are going down.
Well,
there's no like
one of the that's one of the historically fascinating things about inflation is that if you waste many years of your life, as I have, studying the history of political economy, this question of what is the measure of value? What would a standard of value be? David Ricardo is most famous on this because David Ricardo should be, people like to celebrate Adam Smith for reasons I can't quite explain. They should, if they want to celebrate a classical political economist.
He told them what they wanted to hear. It was great.
That's right. If they want to celebrate a classical
political economist, he told them what they wanted to hear.
That's right. They thought he told them what they wanted to hear. But Ricardo came up with a lot of very interesting ideas, devoted himself his entire life to the study of political economy, and was tortured his entire life by this question that you got out by saying, actually, it's not the case that the value of money went down. It's the case that a bunch of things got more expensive and some other things got less expensive, but we're only focusing in this basket we picked on the more expensive, so we call that inflation. But the prices of commodities are moving all of the time, and they move relative to one another. And what Ricardo thought is he could figure out how economics actually worked if he could figure out what the standard was. And the greatest insight he gave us was his failure. There is no standard of value. Like, first he thought, oh, it could be gold. And then he realized, well, that's nonsense, because if it costs more to mine the gold, then the value of gold changes. Then he thought it was going to be corn, because that's what the workers ate. And so this was the key ingredient in all of value. And then he realized, no, that doesn't work either, because when we have certain changes, it may actually make goods that require a lot of labor more expensive relative to goods that don't require a lot of labor, because the workers need more coin. There can never be a standard of value. Now, there can be value changes, but if we were all good Ricardians, what we would do, whenever we say the price of something goes up, we would have to add in relation to this. Like, rents in Seattle have gone up in the last 3 years relative to the price of gas. And instead, what journalists often do is wait for gas to go from $4.50 to $6 and write an inflation story. And when it goes from 6 back to 5.10, nobody writes deflation stories. And this is also, you've heard me say this many times, right? But we're having, to the extent that we're having inflation all the time, and journalists love to like, and it's true, this family is struggling because eggs got more expensive. They used to spend $60 a week on groceries, and now it's $85 a week. They used to fill up their car for $38, and now it's $52. But with gas, for example, it's gone like this, and it's relatively down, and nobody writes the story to follow up. It's as if deflation can't occur. And I think that's because there's some romantic undergirding notion that money is just true in its value, that once we get our paycheck, it's real and in our hands. Whereas in fact, incomes are just another measure of value. And this was what my example was. If everything goes up by 5%, then every month your paycheck goes up by 5%. And you don't notice, except that when you write checks and tap your card, the numbers are longer.
Yeah, it's like pinball, or modern pinball. So I assume that Ricardo tried as a baseline. I mean, I'm already past this, but like, I assume he tried as baseline like wages, some measure of cost of labor. And that was incoherent in some way.
Yes, because the brilliant thing that Ricardo came up with is he realized that different commodities have different amounts of labor and capital mix. And so an argument that existed back in the 16th century, and we still hear today, we hear it right now, it's that if you increase the minimum wage, that will create inflation. If wages go up, that will create inflation. It's this notion that wages are the truth of money's value, and if you increase that, the price of everything goes up. And Ricardo, in his principles, brilliantly takes this on. And just for anybody who doesn't know this, Ricardo is a free trade, pro-capitalist, industrial. This is not some socialist madness. This is as pro-capitalist an argument as you can have. But Ricardo looks at that and says, if you increase wages, it means that commodities that are labor intensive to produce get more expensive relative to commodities that are less labor intensive to produce. There is a movement, but it is a relative movement. And when that relative movement occurs, the stuff that gets cheaper to produce creates an opportunity for capitalists to go, hey, I'm going to stop making this commodity that requires all this labor. I'll go over here and produce this commodity. That then shifts the market. Wages may come down. There may be unemployment. There's all sorts of things moving both toward equilibrium and out of equilibrium. But the fundamental thing is, if you increase wages, will you have inflation? No, you will make some goods more expensive relative to other goods, which means some goods are going to get cheaper. Some goods will become cheaper when you do that.
Do we agree that there is, or can we agree that there is a historical process via which, like, I'm now envisioning, okay, we're sort of inching our way up, and like, here's the price of houses, and then labor costs go up like this, and then something over here. Countries are developing faster than other countries. People come in and put pressure on Seattle because they all want to live here. And that overall drives up prices. Prices are higher. The cost of things are higher. Again, like I said earlier, the only thing I can think of where the dollar amount has actually gone down was a computer. We introduced things that didn't exist 20 years ago, and they're cheap or not cheap, but like, you know, we didn't have smartphones. We get rid of other technologies. But there is a historical process that is like lifting something, right?
Yeah, it's a political process. It's basically a discovery of political economy vis-a-vis capitalism. So
okay, you have to say way more about,
yeah, so let's start off by saying, if we don't have capitalism, there is no reason whatsoever to think that the prices of things would go up. And I'm not going to go into an analysis of feudal or tributary societies, but there is no reason to think in those societies that prices would go up. And the data, and it's hard to collect this data, but the data that we have on this would confirm this. So inflation is a capitalist phenomenon. The idea that prices continue to rise consistently is a capitalist phenomenon, but it is not a universal capitalist phenomenon. So I pointed to Britain in periods of the 19th century where you have deflationary period. We can also point to Japan from 1990 to 2020, where you have deflationary periods, where prices of things do not go up. But one of the things that we've learned, and this is very crude, right? But say over the last 100 years, capitalism is predicated upon growth. It is predicated upon what capitalism is taking money, using it to produce commodities that you can then sell for money. And that process only works if you get more money out at the end than what you put in at the beginning. Otherwise, you don't do capitalist endeavors. And in the most simplest way, if you think that money will buy more stuff a year from now than it buys right now, you will be very disinclined to throw that money into a production process. So if you say to me today, you've got $1 million, you can build a factory, hire a bunch of workers, make a bunch of widgets, and sell them, and I think you will be able to generate $100,000 in profit. And I say, okay, great. And then you say, oh, but by the way, we are in a deflationary period right now. The prices of everything are going down. That means two things. One, the $100,000 in profit might actually be less than $100,000 in profit because everything is going down. So the widgets that I thought I could sell for 1.1 million, I may only be able to sell for 1,050,000, and that just halved my profits. But even worse than that, today I already have $1 million. If $1 million is going to buy more a year from now, maybe I can get a tiny percentage interest on it if I go to the right banker. So I'm really conservative. I don't want to throw my money into a capitalist production process if I'm in a deflationary period. If I'm in an inflationary period, assuming we don't have hyperinflation, and hyperinflation is a different thing, and a lot of the discussions about inflation are conducted in bad faith because they suggest that what's going to happen is that the economy is going to fail because eggs will triple in price every day. When that happens, we have hyperinflation and we have a fundamental failure of our monetary standard. For now, we're just bracketing all of that.
Yeah. Quoting Sam, that is not an economic phenomenon. That is a social political phenomenon.
That's right. That is a crisis that is much bigger than all of this. And it's not at all clear historically that high inflation leads to hyperinflation. So we could have 2%, 4%, 6%, 8%, even 12% inflation. And again, in the 50s and 60s, we had relatively consistently high inflation for a long period of time. It's only in the last 30, 40 years that we've come to think of anything over 2% is high. So the latest inflation numbers from last week are suggesting around 3% is where we are in inflation. If you looked at 20th century averages, we're totally back to normal. And it's only the fact that the Fed now has as their target a super low number of 2%. But their number is 2%. And to refresh people's memory, if we go back just to before the pandemic, the struggle the Fed had over the previous decade was they couldn't get 2% inflation. We were running at 0, a quarter, 0.5% inflation, quarter after quarter after quarter. Everything the Fed was doing to try to stimulate the economy was not getting us 2% inflation. And they want that inflation for, and I've simplified too much, right? But this basics of continuing the capitalist process. If you tell all the capitalists today, we've got deflation coming, they all hold on to their money and they don't make widgets with it. And it's a cycle, right? Because when they do that, now the economy doesn't grow as much, and that increases the deflationary cycle. And so deflation is a very vicious cycle. Inflation can feed on itself, but deflation can feed on itself. And when deflation feeds on itself, it takes the economy down with it. Because now capitalists aren't throwing their money out there, so workers are being laid off. Workers being laid off can't buy stuff, so capitalists can't produce commodities for the workers to buy because the workers don't have jobs, and it goes like that, and government intervention is what it takes to break that cycle.
Why does capitalism not want 10% inflation? It seems like it should want as much inflation as humans will bear, right? The more, I mean, just if you think of capitalism as an entity that wants things, and I'm, you got to go there with me, but like,
yeah, totally.
More capitalism would happen.
I think that capitalism would be pretty stoked about 10% inflation, because that would be fueling the capitalist fire. We very, very quickly need to turn over our capital and make more widgets and sell them and go. Having that high inflation will probably also increase wages to workers, so they will be buying stuff. It's not capital that doesn't like 10% inflation. It's rich people that don't like 10% inflation. Right. They've got some chunk of wealth. They've got some chunk of capital, 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million. And if you have 10% inflation and the 10 million just sits there, after a decade, it does not buy nearly as many yachts or third homes as it did before. If you're in the 19th century Victorian Britain and you've got 0% inflation, the mansion is the mansion. The prices don't change. You have this wealth and it will always buy that much. And in fact, you also then have the capital return to the wealth from the 6% bonds that the government's paying you. So your wealth grows and your wealth just buys more. Whereas when you have consistent high inflation, and this is another way of looking at it. If we go back to our example, let's just say 10% inflation, and it is the most perfect and uniform inflation ever, such that it is not meaningful as the value of money or any of that. It just means that the prices of everything go up by 10%, and we always know they will. Therefore, in everything, we make money on a cycle, we buy goods and services on a cycle. We pay our rent, we buy our groceries, and we get our paycheck. If all of that is going up consistently, our lives don't change. Where our lives change is money credits that we have held over time. That is two things. It's capital that rich people have and debt that poor people have. And high consistent inflation erodes that. $1 million of capital and $1 million loan, they get smaller over time. So rich people are not going to want 10% inflation. They think, hey, I'm going to retire with 3 million. And this is quite concretely true. We're talking in the American context where nobody has a pension, nobody has health insurance until they're quite old. If you think about retiring, you've got to add up some really huge number these days. And let's say you say right now that it's whatever, $2 million. And then I tell you, okay, but for the next decade, we're going to have 10% inflation. Well, your 2 million when you hoped to retire 20 years from now is now not enough. Now you have to have 4 million. So it's eroding that. If you're truly wealthy now and you want to buy lots of fun things like yachts, 10% inflation doesn't help you. You want very, very low inflation.
So you've totally blown my mind. We're in a fight. I mean, we should be in a fight right now between the capitalists and the incredibly wealthy people.
One of the ways of describing 21st century capitalism is that the capitalists, and by capital, you invoked what capital wants, and I've invoked the capitalist. And these are kind of logical structure of things of what is the logic of taking your money, throwing it into a production process to make commodities that you sell for more money. That's what sustains capitalist growth. That category, which I've separated out from people who have $20 million in the bank, rich people. But in practice, in our capitalist societies, they are totally entangled in very, very deep ways because all of those people have all their ETFs at BlackRock, and BlackRock and Vanguard own global capitalism. That's an exaggeration, but shockingly only a small exaggeration, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, no,
so you have this entangled incentive structure where the money that is owning capitalist corporations is coming from the rich people, funneled through companies like BlackRock and Vanguard, and everybody wants to get along. And so while if we imagine the person who is just running their capitalist firm, and they are trying to make profit every production cycle, and you come to them and say, hey, how do you feel about 10% inflation? They're like, whatever, I'm just going to keep selling my widgets. Let's keep going, right? And in fact, at 10% inflation, maybe you could say, oh, well, I locked in a loan for $1 million to buy my factory 2 years ago. Now you're telling me I got 10% inflation. That loan's going to be easier to pay off. So as a capitalist who that's all I think about, I'm very excited about this. But the pension funds, the school pension systems, the people who invest in BlackRock, the fire people who want to retire early, who've saved every penny since they were 19 and have their Vanguard, they don't want inflation. And so we have our capitalist society has connected capitalist production to the interests of lots of people who need their wealth not to be eroded. This, by the way, would look very different 50 years ago. Because if people had, if it was 50 years ago and it's Britain and you have the national health insurance, most jobs have pensions. In a system like that, you don't need to save up a bunch of money. You don't need wealth because pensions are not completely, but in a way immune to this, right? You're going to get a set benefit into the future. It can be adjusted for inflation. We can sort all that out. But we have a lot more people in our capitalist societies today upon whom we've placed the time burden. And by time burden, I mean, I have to predict how much money I need in 20 years so that I don't, live till I'm 84 and run out. Right. And that also creates a system in which a whole lot more people die when they're 82 with $4 million that I'm going to say they didn't need, right? From the perspective of society or their life, they didn't need. And I think we have a system in which this like building up of wealth, generational wealth seems, this is my sense, is that only in the last few years has that become a term that it's just acceptable to use in polite company. I think that term is like a vile curse that I wouldn't say in front of other people, but there's now this sort of notion that, oh, what I need is not just to sustain me and my family through our retirement. I also need to leave enough money to my grandchildren so that they are guaranteed an unequal starting point in society.
Or that they can buy a house, because we've now driven up the cost of housing.
That's right. And that's a fairer way of putting it, right? Is that in some ways, we now think you need generational wealth just to own a home, because it's now normal in many, many cities that, right, in Seattle, if you want to buy an 850 square foot home that you could maybe, like, until your kid's 6 live in, that will cost you $1 million. Yeah. Although I guess one of the things the conversation is doing about inflation is that we talk about inflation when we should be talking about lots and lots and lots of other things. So housing could be cheaper in lots of places. This is not, because inflation also gets talked about like it's some magical alchemical force out there that we don't understand. But like, why are houses too expensive in Seattle? There aren't enough of them. We need to build many, many, many more. Like, we have people who know how to build houses. We even have land you could build it on. So attributing this to, oh, well, it's this inflationary phenomenon, like that's very much distracting us from what would be a different set of conversations of, and again, this gets back to the interests of wealthy people, because what we would need to do in a place like Seattle is, how could we build enough houses so that your house and the house of everyone in your neighborhood is worth less money? Right? Because if we could go out and just build, because you can build a really nice, it happens to be the case, so I will confess that I recently looked at new construction in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. You can build a 3,000 square foot, which is way bigger than anyone needs to live in, unbelievable luxury, beautiful house for $380,000.
Right.
So if we built tens of thousands of those, at a certain point, as lovely as your neighborhood and your house are, it would stop being worth what it's worth. It's worth that much now because if you look at the housing market in Seattle, there are 8 houses for sale. And, and there are a few thousand people who can afford to buy them, and thousands of people who can't. But it doesn't even matter because the supply is so low.
All right. So what do we do?
That seems like an equilibrium point. Yes.
I mean, yeah.